Hey, what's going on, guys? How's everybody doing? So, to close out this week that has so far been dedicated fully to Zhongli, in today's video, we're going to be going deep into the numbers. We're going to be looking at the best weapons and artifacts for both a DPS and a support Zhongli. Now, this video is going to be very in-depth, looking at numbers, looking at spreadsheets. I'm going to try and make it as easy as possible to follow along because there are a lot of numbers on screen, so I'll kind of have a key whenever necessary so that way you guys can easily follow along with all the numbers, as well as explain as we go what all these numbers actually entail. If you are looking for a little bit more general guide, I did already put one out earlier this week going over the entire Zhongli kit in a more broad sense, as well as a team guide with some pretty fun teams to play. But in today's video, we're just looking specifically at what weapons and what artifacts are best for each a main carry setup and a support setup. But before we get into the video, hopefully you guys can help me take down the raid boss that is the YouTube algorithm. Let me know down below in the comments if there is one food item that you would like to try from Genshin Impact. What food item is that? I know for me, I'm a ramen fan. I'm a noodle soup sucker, so I'm going for that Adeptus Temptation, but let me know down in the comment section below what you would go for. Now, with that out of the way, let's hop right into the video. Before we start, I just want to give a couple of disclaimers about the numbers we're going to be talking about because, of course, this game has innumerable variables. There's your artifact set bonuses, what main stats you have, how lucky you get with substats, the refinement of your weapon, critical hits are all probability based, combat is messy so you won't always get optimal performance. So, taking all of these and more into consideration, there are certain variables that I can control and decide how to compute them. All of the future weapons and artifacts were calculated using the same stats, which I would consider overall optimal. So, some weapons might perform better with a different stat setup. For example, crit damage weapons would overall perform better if they had better crit rate, but to keep everything consistent, we'll be using the same stats for all builds. I also can't account for the viability of weapons based on aspects like energy recharge, so use the numbers we talk about more as guidelines and to get an estimate in how close they are in terms of performance as opposed to a concrete list. So with that being said, let's talk artifacts. We'll start off by looking at artifact builds for a main DPS Zhongli. My goal here was not necessarily to find the artifact set with the best DPS, but to see if there was an overall trend that would lead us to the best artifact and weapon pairing. While I don't have all of the weapons I tested on screen, the pattern is consistent. For weapons other than Crescent Pike or Dragonspine Spear that do an extra instance of physical damage, 4-piece Gladiator's Finale will be the highest damage set you can use. But because the two previously mentioned weapons have a passive that scales with physical damage and that can crit independently of your main hit, it benefits you overall to go with a 2-piece Gladiator's Finale and 2-piece Bloodstained Chivalry sets. That being said, the damage difference between these two is not enormous or really even that noticeable. So because of it being easier to farm, Gladiator and Bloodstained is generally the best way to go. Retracing Bolide is a great option still. While not always giving you the best damage, it makes up for that in helping your Zhongli be a bit more tanky by improving his shield performance. We'll take a closer look with how this compares to a strictly damage-based set a bit later. Moving forward, looking at weapons, even though 4-piece Gladiator will typically perform better than 2-piece Gladiator, 2-piece Bloodstained Chivalry, we will be using the 2 and 2 set for our comparisons since it does have the best case scenario usage while wielding a maxed out Crescent Pike. So looking at our weapon chart, we have these ranked in order of overall DPS. This includes auto attack, skill damage and resonance, and burst damage. Of course, we have Crescent Pike at the top as expected by quite a significant margin. While as you can see, the overall damage of Zhongli's skill damage and subsequently his burst damage is quite low relative to where it lies in the ranking, the real damage from this weapon comes from its ability to deal secondary hits that can crit independently. Primordial Jade Winged Spear and Skyward Spine compete in a very close race. Skyward Spine will actually outpace the Jade Spear though when both weapons are at refinement 4 or 5, but because of the consistency across all damage at earlier refinements, the Jade Spear came out slightly ahead. A big shock to me was seeing how high Dragonspine Spear was in the ranking, but a few things to keep in mind. 1. These are simulated numbers assuming optimal performance. This is assuming that you always have a cryo debuff on the enemy and that the icicle hits, since it can actually miss. So because real combat often is not the same as simulated numbers, in most cases its performance will be closer to where Blackcliff Pole currently is. Speaking of Black Cliff Pole, this weapon and Staff of Homa are two weapons that potentially get hurt by the fact that when I run these calculations, I have to keep all the artifact sets the same for consistency's sake. Because of our relatively low crit rate compared to their crit damage, our crit proportions are not really ideal and put them slightly lower than where they would be with a more properly built artifact set. But since we're assuming that you have one set of artifacts without the luxury of switching pieces around, this is still a decent way to tier the weapons. Just keep in mind that if your crit rate is a bit higher than I have here, or your crit damage is a bit lower, the crit damage weapons should be prioritized a bit more highly. Next, I want to take a look at the overall kit potential of one built strictly around damage and another trying to play all the angles, that being retracing Bolide. The question is, now is Zhongli's buff increasing all of his damage off of a percentage of his max HP, not just his burst, how does it affect his overall damage output with an HP Timepiece over an attack one? And the answer is not great. In terms of damage, it's still better off to go with an attack timepiece, at least for the main DPS build. But we do have a much larger shield with an HP timepiece on our retracing Bolide set. But is that worth the damage loss? Basically, what it comes down to is this. For the most damage, but less protection, 2-piece Gladiator's Finale and 2-piece Bloodstained Chivalry with an attack timepiece. For the most protection, 4-piece Retracing Bolide with an HP Timepiece. And for the most well-rounded set dealing a little bit less damage, but also gaining some shield capacity, 4-piece Retracing Bolide with an attack Timepiece. These, paired with a Crescent Pike, will give you the most optimal performance as a main DPS. Next, let's move on to support build by first taking a look at the potential artifact sets that we could conceivably use. The choice is pretty clear here. As a support, the only set bonuses that we can really use are those that increase our burst damage, since there are currently no set bonuses that affect our shield while Zhongli is off the battlefield. Naturally, 2-piece Archaic Petra and 2-piece Noblesse Oblige do this perfectly, taking the lead here. Though the 35% total bonus across these two sets does actually get tied by the elemental boosting sets, Thunder Soother and Lava Walker, as long as you're hitting enemies affected by the relative element. 4-piece Noblesse is not that far behind though, and should you find yourself without another decent user, Zhongli will be a fine choice for this set, though you will lose out a small amount of damage on your skill. Moving forward, we'll be using the 2-piece Archaic Petra and 2-piece Noblesse Oblige for our calculations, as this is clearly the best choice for consistent damage. The next thing we'll want to look at is what is the most optimal artifact main stat setup. Since Zhongli's job as a support will be to focus on shielding his teammates as opposed to his main DPS build, we will want to more heavily weigh builds that increase his shield capacity. Naturally, as we move down the list and add more HP pieces, our shield increases, but at what point do we start losing out on damage? To simplify these numbers, we have 4 tiers of shields: those with 0 HP artifacts, 1 artifact, 2, and 3. All of those with 0 HP artifacts have a capacity of 5,441. Those with 1 have 6,668, and so on. You can see the correlations. Only one configuration will have the largest shield, but since the damage is pretty low, we can safely knock this one off the list. I would also safely knock out all the builds without an HP artifact. While the damage does get quite high once we start adding geo damage pieces and crit pieces, we aren't adding any capacity to our shield, which weakens Zhongli's capabilities as a support. That leaves us with builds with 1 HP artifact and 2. We can see that there is one configuration that far outdamages the others, and that is the HP piece, geo damage piece, and crit damage piece, followed closely by 2 HP pieces and crit damage, HP, geo, and crit rate, and HP, geo, and HP. But because the HP, geo, and crit rate build has a lower shield capacity than the other 2 options, I would lower the priority of this build, which leaves us our top 3. Now we can finally get to the weapons, and you'll see a lot of numbers here. So before we break any of this down, let me first fill you in on what it is we're exactly looking at. Because about half of these weapons have a passive that can stack, but because normally you won't be increasing these stacks with Zhongli as a support, I went ahead and included both, numbers without any passive stacks and those with full passive stacks. On any weapon with 2 sets of white numbers, the top numbers are the damage of Zhongli's burst with the non-crit damage first, followed by the crit hit. The second level of white numbers is the weapon with its maximum passive activated. Same deal here with critical hits. Finally, we have the blue and red numbers, which are the averages of both sets of numbers, the blue being the average damage with no passive, the red being with passives. In general, I ordered these based on their minimum passive average, though I made a few subjective decisions based on the overall weapon. Let me explain. Staff of Homa. While based on its average damage, should be below Deathmatch, because it increases our HP by a flat percent with its passive, it's more important to what we're trying to achieve with Zhongli as it helps beef up his shield a bit. It also succumbs to the same complication I mentioned earlier in the video, in that with the build I'm using to calculate averages, the crit damage is heavily weighted. So with a more even build with a bit more crit rate, Staff of Homa would certainly come out on top of Deathmatch. I mean, just look at the difference in damage on the top end of these two weapons. Staff of Homa can certainly afford to give up a bit of crit damage for a bit more crit rate. The other weapon that falls in the same category is Blackcliff Pole, which I've bumped up one position to compensate, as this weapon will surely outdo White Tassel with a more balanced build. That being said, Black Tassel is an extremely competitive free-to-play weapon that does in fact both hit harder and provide a bigger shield than White Tassel, but because of the crit rate subset on White Tassel, it propelled this weapon slightly higher than its darker counterpart. The last big change I made to this was drop Crescent Pike alongside Dragonspine Spear. While its damage is technically higher than Dragon's Bane or Prototype Star Glitter and is tied with Favonius Lance, more often than not, the energy recharge on these weapons plus how easy it is to manage the Dragon's Bane passive puts these weapons above the Pike. And that is pretty much that. Hopefully you guys were able to follow along. I know that was a lot of numbers. It was a lot more than I'm used to dealing with, but I think that it should give you a pretty decent overview as to what Zhongli's best weapons and artifacts and overall builds are. Hopefully you guys did find this guide helpful, and if you liked what you saw and you want to see more content from me, you can head over to my Twitch page, twitch.tv/xjazze, or you can support me right here on YouTube by clicking that red subscribe button, like the video if you liked it, and hit that notification bell. That way you never miss a video. And of course, if you do want to join our community over on Discord, link as always will be down in the description below. But guys, that's all I got for today. Hopefully you did enjoy, as I said before. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.